What up, guys? Coach Joe here. It is Mobility Monday. What I want to talk about today is lateral hip pain. So we get a lot of people that come in. We've got a lot of runners that come here and a lot of people that like to lift weights because that's what we do here at BFP. And if we've got sort of a movement deviation when we're lifting weights or a movement deviation whenever we're running, you can start to get pain right on that lateral hip. We get a lot of people who pretty much point to it, or you can kind of feel for that bone, right, and walk your way down. So there's a bone that sticks out here, the greater trochanter. It's just part of your femur down here in your leg. It's that bony prominence that you feel up here, and there's muscles that sort of attach over top of that bony prominence, like they wrap around it, and they help keep it in place and help stabilize the pelvis, almost like the rotator cuff does for your shoulder. So there's some people that say, like, if you think about your shoulder, our big muscles like our deltoids, they help move the arm. And the rotator cuff helps to steer it, right? And if we're looking at the hips, there's a glute medius, glute minimus, and a few other smaller ones that help steer the hip. When the big stuff, like the glutes, the TFL, and the quads, they help to move the hip. So some of these steering muscles are the ones that tend to have issues at the tendon site. So if you think about how most people stand during the day, a lot of people tend to put a lot of weight on one hip, right? And that takes your knee and puts it sort of central to your pelvis, and then that greater trochanter, that bone that's sticking out, is pushed into the tendons that go across the top of it, which are related to those muscles that help steer the hip that I was talking about. This can lead to pain over time from standing like this, because that knee goes in and that stretches those tendons and pulls them in across the top of that greater trochanter, right? And that's a stretching force that's pulling on them. And then you've got the bone kind of grinding on those tendons, and it starts to hurt over time. And it usually takes time for this to start to hurt. So standing on sort of one hip dominant can do that. If we've got somebody who likes to sit, cross their leg over a lot, or even sit like this, or if we're bringing those knees in whenever we sit, that can do the same thing. Any position really where our knee is in and our hip is out more than it is normally. Females are a little bit higher risk for this. And they generally say people with a wider set pelvis, because that angle, that stretch that's put across the tendon can be a little bit more at times, depending on how your pelvis is set. But there's also a movement discrepancy or movement compensation you might see if you're in here squatting, if you've had an injury in one knee at one point and your body sort of pulls away from it when we squat. So if I go down into a squat, and usually this will present itself in really heavy sets. If it happens in light sets, then we might need to scale down from squats. Otherwise, if you're having a lot of lateral hip pain, we can still squat and deadlift. We just probably can't do it very heavy. So what you'll usually see when somebody has this issue, it's from squatting and or deadlifting or different hip movements over time. Whereas they go down, their hip shifts out. Hopefully you can see that, but the hip starts to shift out, and it's not always that easy to see. But when the hip shifts out, the knee goes in to help create tension through here and keep the pelvis stabilized somewhat. But again, it's stretching and pushing on those tendons in the hip, and that can usually be why it hurts. Now, some people will get diagnosed with bursitis, and a bursa sac is, just think of it as a little pillow there for cushion. Sometimes that can get inflamed. Sometimes they can both become inflamed or become reactive and be a site of pain. It's very hard to tell the difference. It's definitely not my job. That's the job of your doctor or your physical therapist. But when I talk to them, these are some of the things they tell me. So it can be tough to tell the difference between the two. Now, like I said, you can continue squatting and you can continue deadlifting, doing all those great things for those big muscles that we do. But we want to make sure that we don't do those things if that movement compensation where the hip shifts out is presenting itself. So we'd want to scale back on intensity from that. It might happen when you're really fatigued, like if you've just done a lot of cardio, you're a really intense Metcon, or it can happen when it's heavy weight. So we can start with a couple of different things to work on this. And most of these you could do in your warm-up because you're trying to turn on some of that musculature that'll help pull those hips back in the center. And there's no surprise here that I've talked about these exercises before, and that we do a couple of these exercises a lot here at Breakaway. So the first way we can do this is through isometrics. This allows us to work the musculature, to turn the musculature on if it's not turning on when it should. But it's without a lot of movement. So if the pain level is high, we can still challenge that musculature without the pain. Take a look.
So an isometric movement is really where we hold any joint position for a specific period of time, so you're contracting all those muscles. So this is a side leg raise, my hips push back just a little bit. You want to be able to hold this for at least 30 seconds and keep those toes pointed forward nice and straight the entire time. The second isometric we can work on is keeping that band around the knees and just pushing out very, very hard on that band so we wake the gluteus medius muscles up.
Now, once we move on from isometrics, we can go into our traditional type warm-up movements where we put a band like one of these. These are much more intense. These are a lot easier. So I'm going to demonstrate with this one. And to turn on some of that musculature that I'm talking about, we want to move laterally because they help us move laterally somewhat, but really, like I said, they stabilize the hips. They keep you from walking with that hip swing out. So if there's no pain, you can put the band all the way down on the heels or on the ankles. Some people will put it around their feet, on their toes. I'm going to start with it around the knees because this is the simplest way to demonstrate. But you can do that lateral side step that we've talked about before. So you just want a good posture position, a little bit of bend here, a little bit of bend here. Now when you step, I want to make sure your foot doesn't turn out, and I want to make sure it's not a lot of reaching because that's going to force us to use the wrong musculature. So I'm not going to lean over and then step that leg out. I want you to sort of push off. If I'm going to go that way, if I'm going to go to my right, I want you to sort of push off this leg. So push and then step. Push off and then step. So I'm not doing a lot of reaching with the leading leg. If I go that way, I'm going to push off with this leg and then step. And push off and then step. And that's going to prime that glute medius to wake it up and get it working so we're not overusing another muscle that's kind of on the front called the tensor fasciae latae that we tend to overuse at times when these glutes aren't working the right way. So push off that stance leg. Now that's one way. So we've gone through the isometrics and we go into some isolation type exercises to try to activate things. And then in your warm-up, whether you've got a barbell on your back or whether you're just doing this body weight, we can keep this band around the knees. And what we're going to do is add a tactile cue or touch. Like if you had bad posture in a lift like this and someone said squeeze your shoulder blades together and they touched your upper back, you pull back. And the goal is for that to start with that touch. And then we don't use the touch anymore when we're working with you and that becomes a habit. So we can start with this band where you feel this around your knees and it's pulling your knees in and you got to push your knees out against it. And you can work on your squats that way. Very, very slowly and controlled, keeping those hips in the center. So when we push those knees out against the band, it fires up those glute medius muscles, those ones that help us steer the hips, right? And we can drop into that squat and then drive up. Just make sure you keep your full foot in contact with the ground. You can even do this when you're warming up for your back squats with a barbell. Same thing, driving those knees out, dropping down and coming back up. And then you can work your way up in weight like you normally would. We just want to make sure that again, you don't go to a weight where that hip shift starts to present itself. So today, what I talked about is lateral hip pain for Mobility Monday. We didn't really get into mobility stuff, but I think that all this applies in terms of folks that are dealing with that lateral hip pain. And we get a lot of people that come in that like to run when they're outside of here, then they come in and lift weights, and we don't have real strong steering muscles for the hip, and they tend to have issues with that lateral hip. So if you have any questions at all about this, throw them in the comments below. I'll be happy to answer them. Happy Mobility Monday.